Hello, my name is Samantha Hill, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Hana Oran Center for Thinking in Politics at Bard College. Welcome to our virtual reading group. This week we're going to be talking about Hana Arendt's lecture, Labor, Work, and Action, and the Human Condition. This lecture, Labor, Work, and Action, was originally given in 1967. About 9 years after she published The Human Condition in 1958. This is a really lovely, condensed, I think it's 13 pages, reading of pretty much the first half of The Human Condition, walking through the categories of labor, work, action, the web of human relationships, the principle of plurality, her understanding of action, new beginnings, and freedom. Hana Oran is a conceptual political thinker. She's always working in concepts and categories. And so this is a really nice foundational lecture that introduces us to a number of the fundamental concepts she's using to think about politics in the contemporary context. So what I would like to do is just kind of walk through the principal concepts that she's outlining in Labor, Work, and Action, which are so fundamental to the body of her work. She begins by asking the question, what does an active life consist of? What do we do when we are active? And in order to begin to answer that question, she starts from the medieval distinction between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, the life of the mind and the life of action. And this is a theme that she returns to throughout the course of her work. And she's going to say that the life of action has always been thought about from the point of view of the political thinker, from the point of view of the vita contemplativa. And she begins the book on thinking and the life of the mind with a similar sentiment, and makes the kind of funny remark that the philosophers who spent their careers talking about the vita activa never took the time to stop and write about what it is the vita contemplativa in itself is, what is the life of thinking. And so she draws out this distinction in order to set up the hierarchy between what she considers to be the fundamental human activities for the life of action. She says on 291 on the first page that active life, let's go up, for even if we don't contest the traditional assumption that contemplation is of a higher order than action, or that all action actually is but a means whose true end is contemplation, we can't doubt, and no one has ever doubted, that it is quite possible for human beings to go through life without ever indulging in contemplation. While, on the other hand, no man can remain in the contemplative state throughout his whole life. Active life, in other words, is not only what most men are engaged in, but even what no man can escape altogether, for it is the nature of the human condition that contemplation remains dependent upon all sorts of activities. And then she's going to talk about the fundamental things that are necessary for contemplation, but it's quite possible that many people will pass through life without ever engaging in self-reflective critical thinking in any real capacity, that you can avoid contemplation, but you can't avoid action. Everybody has to act. And this is where she's going to end this lecture, the principle of action, and that men were born not to die, but to make new beginnings, right? And this is concomitant with her understanding of the principle of freedom. But in order to have the space for the life of contemplation, which she's not going to talk about here, we have to have labor. We have to acquire a certain freedom from necessity. We need quiet. We need the four walls of the house, right? Labor and work and action, to a certain extent, create the conditions that are necessary for the life of contemplation. So if we jump ahead a couple of pages to 295, she's going to give us a little summary of the way that she understands labor. All right, so labor has always occupied the lowest rung on the totem pole in terms of the different activities, the fundamental activities of the human condition. And this is one of the primary reasons she is critical of Marx. Marx tried to elevate labor and tried to understand labor in terms of work or action, and oriented us towards laboring as a bodily activity, and labor is necessary to liberate man. But then she said, if labor is what man is fundamentally does, what is he being liberated to? And so she's pushing back against Marx here, and she wants to talk about labor in the terms of consumer goods as opposed to works, right? To handicrafts or things that are made that have a certain amount of durability in the world. So she says on 295, labor, in other words, produces consumer goods. And laboring and consuming are but two stages of the ever-recurring cycle of biological life. These two stages of the life process follow each other so closely that they almost constitute one and the same movement, which is hardly ended when it must be started all over again. So there are certain characteristics that define the laboring activity for Arendt. She likes to use Locke's phrase, the labor of the body and the work of our hands. Labor is always bodily. It's bodily in the sense that to perform labor, we are using the body. This was Marx's definition of man, that he could apply his bodily power to objects in the natural world and transform them into things, right? So labor is a bodily activity. But for Arendt, it also has another meaning, that it's connected to biological life, right? We produce and we consume and we produce and we consume, and it's this endless cycle of consumption, which in itself is another, what's the word? Another, I want to say image, but it's not image, that it's essentially mimicking what it is that the body does, right? Day after day, that we consume and we sleep and we wake up and we work and we consume and we sleep. And it's this endless cycle of repetition. And so the next element that she talks about is repetition. The production of consumer goods relies upon a kind of endless repetition, which is different. She wants to separate that away from how Marx is thinking about laboring as a repetitive activity. And then on page 296, and she's talking about the production of goods for the consumption, that these laboring goods, which are produced for consumption, are the least worldly and tangible of things that can be made. Okay. And then she says on the second paragraph, but while labor in the sense of producing anything lasting, something outlasting the activity itself, and even the lifespan of the producer is quite unproductive and futile, it is highly productive in another sense. So labor is not productive of things which last in the world and help us to artifice the world that we make together, but it does produce something. And she says it is quite unproductive and futile, highly productive in another sense. Man's labor power is such that he produces more consumer goods than is necessary for the survival of himself and his family. This, as it were, natural abundance of the laboring process has enabled men to enslave or exploit their fellow men, thus liberating themselves from life's burden. And while this liberation of the few has always been achieved through the use of force by a ruling class, it would never have been possible without the inherent fertility of human labor itself. So she's talking about the production of excess, right? So she's talking about the economic wealth that is generated through the production of these consumer goods, which leads to those who occupy the I think today we call them the 1%, but I don't think that's quite what she's talking about. But those who own the means of production, to use Marx's phrase, it allows them to liberate themselves from certain burdens of life, as Arendt calls them. So it does not produce worldly goods that help us to make the world together, but it does allow us to create institutions of exploitation and slavery. Okay. On the other side of labor, we have work. And work is what allows us to produce durable things that last in the world. On the bottom of 297, she says, the work of our hands, so she's going to break apart the quote here to distinguish labor from work. The work of our hands, as distinguished from the labor of our bodies, fabricates the sheer unending variety of things whose sum total constitutes the human artifice, the world we live in. They are not consumer goods, but use objects. Okay, so now we have consumer goods and use objects, and labor is productive of consumer goods, and work is productive of use objects. And their proper use does not cause them to disappear. They give the world the stability and solidity without which it cannot be relied upon to house the unstable and mortal creature that is man. To be sure, the durability of the world of things is not absolute. We do not consume, use things, but use them up. And if we don't, they will simply deteriorate, return into the overall process from which they were drawn and against which they were erected by us. And she gives the example of a chair in the wood. The durability of the objects which are produced through work for Arendt give them what she calls objectivity. There's a great one of the poems of Arendt's that I translated, which was a post-war poem. She reflects upon what she's going to later call the frailty of the realm of human affairs, and this concept of durability. The streets and the houses that we travel on and live in every day, we take for granted, and they provide a fundamental infrastructure that allows us to go about our daily lives. And we think that they are, in a certain way, more durable than we are as human beings, and we rely upon them. But she wants us to be aware of the fundamental frailty and fragility as well that inheres in the world of things that we are constantly making together. She doesn't talk about it in these summary pages of the human condition in this lecture, but the most durable of objects, although not an object, that she talks about is the poem, right? Poems are the most durable thought things that can be created because they are the most condensed. They contain the most meaning. And they're the closest to thinking and worldliness, the far opposite end of labor. So she's going to then, before she transitions to action, she's going to talk about the utilitarian logic of production, which is embedded in both the laboring process and the work process, where we think in terms of means and ends. Right? And she's going to hold up this idea of means ends thinking as a certain kind of thinking that should not be applied to human relationships. Right? And then she's going to talk about means and ends in production, but on 303, she transitions to action. And she says, the man-made world of things becomes a home for mortal men, whose stability will endure and outlast the ever-changing movement of their lives and deeds, only insofar as it transcends both the sheer functionalism of consumer goods and the sheer utility of use objects. Life in its non-biological sense, that is, the span of time each man is given between birth and death, manifests itself in action and speech, to which we now turn our attention. With word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world, and this insertion is like a second birth. in which we confirm and take upon ourselves the naked fact of our original physical appearance. Okay, so this concept of action, of appearing in a public realm before one another as equals in our words and deeds, is Arendt's fundamental understanding of what makes us human. What makes us human is our ability to appear before one another in our plurality, right? So for Marx, who elevated labor to the highest of the human activities, what fundamentally made us human was our ability to apply the energy of our bodies to objects to transform them into things, right? But for Arendt, what fundamentally makes us human is our ability to appear before one another in our plurality, right? And so she elevates, of course, action to the highest of the human activities. What fundamentally makes us human is our ability to distinguish ourselves from one another as equals in our speech and in our actions in the public realm, right? And so here she's going to, in 304, bottom of 304 to 305, she's going to get in this conversation, this old conversation of who-ness and what-ness, and what it is we are versus who it is we are, and how we appear before one another within the web of human relationships. So plurality, the Aristotelian idea of plurality, which she sums up here, is it's at the top of the first full paragraph on 304. She says that it's men and not man who inhabit Earth and make the world together, right? We have to exist with one another in the world. And she says, but only action and speech relate specifically to the fact that to live always means to live among men, among those who are my equals. And by equals, she's not making any kind of social claim here beyond the idea that we all are capable of appearing in word and deed with one another. In other places, she talks about how certain things aren't necessary for us to appear in the public realm in the first place, but she's not going to talk about that here. Right? And she says, action and speech are so closely related because the primordial and specifically human act must always also answer the question asked of every newcomer. So newcomer, just to stop there for a second, is a word that she is particularly fond of. The German is Anfänger, and it also has the understanding of beginning something new, right? Somebody who's beginning. She called new students in her classrooms Anfänger, and new students coming in. Who are you? Right? This is has always struck me as a kind of profound political gesture, especially after I left DC after living there for several years, where every time I went to a social function, somebody would walk up to me and say, who do you work for? Or what do you do, as opposed to who are you? It's not a question we commonly ask one another. She says the disclosure of who somebody is implicit in the fact that speechless action somehow does not exist. Or if it exists, it is irrelevant. Without speech, action loses the actor, and the doer of deeds is possible only to the extent that he is at the same time the speaker of words, who identifies himself as the actor and announces what he is doing, what he has done or what he intends to do. It is exactly as Dante once said, and more succinctly that I could, for in every action what is primarily intended by the doer is the disclosure of his own image. Hence it comes about that every doer, insofar as he does, takes delight in doing, since everything that is desires its own being, and since in action the being of the doer is somehow intensified, delight necessarily follows. Thus nothing acts unless by acting it makes patent its latent self. So this idea of who-ness, right, this long quote from Dante echoes off of some other quotes she likes. It's reminiscent of the quote she uses from Char in order to characterize how we experience appearing before one another in our vulnerability, our nakedness in the public realm, and showing ourselves to be who we are without any kind of pretense. When we speak to one another in the public realm, when we enter into conversation with one another, we are not just disclosing who we are and distinguishing ourselves as unique individuals from one another, but for Arendt, we are, in the sense of newcomer, we are also beginning something new, right? Every time we engage in speech and deed, we are engaging in a new beginning. But this new beginning isn't sui generis in the world. The new beginning inserts itself into the pre-existent web of human relationships, as she calls it. On 305, she says it is because of this already existing web of human relationships, with its conflicting wills and intentions, that action almost never achieves its purpose. And it is also because of this medium and the attendant quality of unpredictability that action always produces stories, with or without intention, as naturally as fabrication produces tangible things. Okay, so action, engaging in action for Arendt, is not operative within the logic of means ends categories. Action in itself is always productive of a new beginning, and one of the fundamental qualities of action for Arendt is that we can never predict the end of action because each action is a new beginning, right? And so we can't know what is going to unfold, what the effect of our actions will be. What is produced, so labor, we have consumer goods, work, we have use objects, action is productive of stories, right? She says in the human condition that everyone has the right to be remembered, right? That we remember one another's unique actions and words through the telling of stories, right? So she says, just a little further down, these stories may then be recorded in documents and monuments. They may be told in poetry and historiography and worked into all kinds of material. They themselves, however, are of an entirely different nature from these reifications. They tell us more about their subjects, the hero, in each story than any product the human hands ever tells us about the master who produced it. And yet they are not products, properly speaking. Although everybody starts his own story, at least his own life story, nobody is the author or producer of it. So we can't tell our own story fully. We need it to be told for us. And yet it is precisely in these stories that the actual meaning of a human life finally reveals itself, that every individual life, between birth and death, can eventually be told as a story, with beginning and end as the pre-political and prehistorical condition of history, the great story without beginning or end. And then on the final page and a half, she's going to talk about the frailty of human affairs and freedom. Right? In the first full paragraph on 306. Right, she says the smallest act in the most limited circumstances bears the seed of the same boundlessness and unpredictability. One deed, one gesture, one word may suffice to change every constellation. And acting, in contradistinction to working, it is indeed true that we can never know what we are doing. This stands, however, in stark contrast to the frailty and unreliability of human affairs. Another character of human action which seems to make it even more dangerous than we would otherwise assume. And this is the simple fact that though we don't know what we are doing when we are acting, we have no possibility ever to undo what we have done. The processes of action are not only unpredictable, they are also irreversible, which is to say that in action there is no author or maker who can undo or destroy what he has done if he does not like it or when the consequences prove disastrous. So she doesn't go into it here, but in the human condition, she spends quite a bit of time after this section talking about the need for forgiveness, promises and forgiveness, which in the unpredictability and the frailty of the realm of human affairs and the web of human relations, what allows us to continue beginning anew again and to maintain this web of human relationships in a certain sense is our ability to forgive one another and our ability to make promises with one another. Because we can never fully know the consequences of what it is that we're doing. But on the top of 307, she just says, without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to achieve the identity and continuity which together produce the person about whom a story can be told. Each of us would be condemned to wander helplessly and without any direction in the darkness of his own lonely heart, caught in its ever-changing moods, contradictions, and equivocalities. But this personal identity, achieved through binding oneself in promises, must be distinguished from the objective identity that arises out of being confronted with the sameness of chairs and houses. So she's separating these things that we make between one another from the things that are made through labor and work in order to think about their durability and their frailty, right? Both of which are greater than the use products and consumer products that we rely upon in many ways to simply move through life. And then she ends on the note of action and freedom. Without action, without the capacity to start something new, and thus articulate the new beginning that comes into the world with the birth of each human being, the life of man spent between birth and death would inevitably be doomed beyond salvation. The lifespan itself would be running toward death, inevitably carrying everything human to ruin and destruction. And then just to skip down, with the creation of man, the principle of beginning came into the world, which, of course, is only another way of saying that with the creation of man, the principle of freedom appeared on earth. We were born not to die, but to begin something new. And that ability to begin something new through word and deed by appearing in the public realm of human affairs before one another, to distinguish ourselves and our right to be remembered and our uniqueness and our who-ness, is part of the way that Arendt is understanding the principle of freedom. Okay? And this echoes really nicely with the end of the origins of totalitarianism, where she talks about the holes of oblivion and the abyss. One of the gravest horrors of the Holocaust was the disappearance of people from the public realm of human affairs. And she plays with this a little and changes it in other places. But the opposite of freedom is the inability to appear before one another, to engage in speech and action, to distinguish ourselves from one another in public. So I'm going to stop there. There are a lot of different concepts that she's weaving together intentionally in order to offer a portrait of the world. I often read the human condition as the kind of mirror image of the origins of totalitarianism. If totalitarianism is the absence of freedom and the possibility of horror and barbarism in the world, in the human condition, what Arendt is doing by developing these conceptual categories of labor, work, action, private, social, public, is constructing the spaces that are necessary for freedom. It's our ability to move between these different activities and these different spaces that signifies freedom for Arendt. And whenever we see them collapsing in upon one another, whenever we see the social collapsing and the private and the political falling in upon one another, it's a kind of red flag that totalitarianism is encroaching. In order to preserve spaces of freedom, we have to conceptualize what the different spaces and activities of life are. And so I see her doing that in the human condition as a way of envisioning the world of human activity. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking. I've been talking for a while. Are there questions? None in the chat box yet. Thoughts?
Samantha?
Susan?
Yeah, Suzanne.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi. We were asked to read this piece alongside the essay called The Human Condition in this book.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know if this is what you want to deal with right now, but I think it was really important to have put those pieces side by side. At least for me, they went together really nicely. So if you could address a little bit that decision.
I'm sure. So I mean, I paired the readings together that I thought would go
Okay.
nicely together. Is there something specific in this essay that you wanted to talk about? Or
Well,
did
I
you just
guess,
want me to kind of talk about what she's doing?
yeah, well, I think, what for me, there's always this issue of, okay, what is going on here in the public sphere, as we
Yes.
act. And it seems to me that in the human condition, she fills that out a bit in an important way. She, when she talks about, I mean, it's it's as if it's really our only hope. I mean, it becomes clear to me in the human condition that at least for her, it's almost our only
Do you
hope.
do you mean
That
the short
Yeah,
essay
I mean
that
this.
she wrote,
Yeah,
or do you mean the
yeah.
book, The Human Condition?
I mean the short essay that I think we were
Okay.
asked to read for today too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean in that short essay where she's, for me at least, filling out um, kind of how at this point in the evolution of human civilization, uh, what the only hope is to engage in this kind of action in the public sphere.
So
That.
to engage in this kind of action in the public sphere in the way that she's thinking about speech and deed,
Mhm.
but also in this, also the effects that technology, for
Right.
example, are possibly going to have upon our our ability for thinking and
Hmm.
remembrance, and how she uses the word cybernetics. How these different technological forms are going to fundamentally change the human character and pose potential threats to what she understands to be fundamental to human freedom. We can look at on page 322 and 323. Um, she's Let's skip down. She says, first of all, cybernation is a new phenomena. Okay. It must be distinguished from the Industrial Revolution of the past. The Industrial Revolution consisted of replacing muscle power, not brain power. And she understands, just a note, she understands Marx to be a great political philosopher, in part because he is addressing the political question of his day, which is the question of how the Industrial Revolution is fundamentally reshaping the human activity of laboring. And so I think, here she, in several bits of her writing, she takes on the question of the development of technology in a similar way. She says, today machines can take over a certain amount of human activity, which we have always identified as the activity of the human mind. This calls, in my opinion, for a reevaluation of mental activity. What we must ask is intellectual activity as such. And then she gives the example of chess playing in the skip down. She says, brain power is not the same in different individuals, just as muscle power is not the same, since not everybody has an equal share of either one. but that does not mean anything about the level at which a human being functions or about his special qualifications as a human being, right? And she gives the example of Mr. Perk. Mr. Perk talked about the fortunate fact that we can erase memory in the computing machine quite easily, but that is not so easily done in human beings, where the process is called brainwashing. Arendt is in every piece in this work, and in much of her work, she is very concerned with the faculty of thinking and the relationship between thinking and action. How is it that we as individuals can engage in self-reflective, critical thinking as opposed to any form of reductive, deductive, or ideological thinking? And she understands our ability to remember one another, to record one another, to tell stories about one another, to be essential to human freedom, right? And so the loss of memory in individuals, I understand her to see this as a threat to that fundamental capacity for remembering one another, right? It's that when we appear before one another in the public sphere and we recognize one another, that we remember one another. And if we no longer have the capability to do that, or if we give that away to our iPhones where we're recording conversations instead of remembering them, then this fundamentally alters the way she's conceptualizing action as an activity and what it means to appear before one another in the public realm. She says, we know, of course, that remembrance, as distinguished from the simple technical faculty of memory, will stay with us regardless of the functions memory may or may not perform. To lose remembrance would indeed deprive us of a whole dimension of human life, namely the dimension of the past. Similarly, we would have to reevaluate and distinguish thought from the technical function of the brain, just as we distinguish remembrance from the technical function of memory. Okay. Harold, I see your question. I don't have the exact date for this lecture, or these notes. I assume that it was in the same time frame. I can look it up and see if I can find it. It's unfortunately a lot of the dates for many of these essays weren't included in the publication of the volume, but I might be able to find it digging through the archival papers. Did that in part answer your question, Suzanne, about tying them together?
Yeah, it does. But can I just push it a little bit? I was in the middle of typing this, but I'll say it instead.
Sure.
In this bringing together, of thinking and action, as she does it here and as she does it in many other places, is she in some way bringing back the distinction between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa? I mean, are those categories still working for her, but now in a different kind of way?
So she's critical. So in the modern era, she understands there to be a fundamental reversal in the terms of the vita contemplativa and the vita activa.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see her trying to flip them again in a certain way and to reevaluate the categories of action. So from Plato onward, the life of the mind and the life of thinking was considered to be the highest form of the human activities, and any form of human action was done in the service of creating space for the life of the mind. And this changes for Arendt in the modern era with Smith and Locke and Marx, and the changes that occur in labor. And so Marx, in the seventh thesis on Feuerbach, has the famous, man up to this point has only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it, right? To do something. And this is a shift away from the life of contemplation and thinking towards an emphasis on the life of doing, right? Towards a life of action. And what Marx does for Arendt is he elevates labor, what had been historically within the Western tradition been understood to be the lowest of the human activities, to the highest of the human activities. And so we have labor moving up. But for Arendt, there are problems with this, right? It's the elevation of what is most animal about us to our highest capacity, as opposed to thinking and logic and reason, right? And engaging in thought. And she sees she has two fundamental issues with what Marx is doing in his elevation of labor. One is she disagrees with the idea that laboring is our fundamental human capacity, and that in order to liberate ourselves from labor, we have to engage in labor. But if labor is our fundamental human capacity and we liberate ourselves from our ability to labor, then what are we being liberated to? What are we left with as human beings? The other problem that she returns to in the first, she mentions it here and in a couple other places in this text, is that what Marx did when he flipped Hegel on his head in order to discover the movement of world history was a simple replication of the Hegelian form, which is dialectics, the dialectical movement of world history. And for Arendt, dialectical thinking is a determinist form of thinking. So she would put it together with ideology or deductive reasoning. So Marxisms are different than Marx, but a Marxism is very much a form of ideology. And as long as you're operating according to a dialectical framework for thinking about history, you know the end of history, right? And so Arendt always is pushing against any kind of framework that forecloses the space of thinking. So she's in the work on thinking, she attempts to offer us a portrait of thinking from the life of a thinker, right? And labor is necessary in the world, right? We need labor. So is work, right? We need to produce things. But I also see her emphasizing thinking and in trying to engage in this reversal of the vita activa with the vita contemplativa. She says very clearly in the couple of the essays in interviews on Eichmann in here, and the interview with Richard Herrera and the panel she did on Hana Oran, that there's a fundamental claim that she's making on thinking as a human activity, that thinking has the ability to prevent evil in the world, right? And evil for Arendt is caused by people who act without thinking, people who do without thinking. And so she's drawing a connection between the reversal of the vita contemplativa and the vita activa with the phenomenal emergence of evil of evil in the world, but also bureaucracy, which she spends a lot of time talking about in the origins of totalitarianism, unthinking activity, mindlessness, and thinking about the way mindlessness is then embedded in our daily activities, down to our speech patterns and the kinds of words we use when we're speaking unreflectively. So she's making a very strong claim on the loss of the vita contemplativa in the modern era, and arguing that, in a way, I don't want to use the word reclaim, but she's trying to turn us toward thinking, toward the life of experience, towards the life of action, and the life of thinking as away from the life of just doing. She's wrestling with um, what she calls the break in tradition. That was a very long answer to your to that question. Um, Suzanne, do you want to respond at all? I'm sorry. You can stop me.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jennifer asks, can a loss of cultural memory be applied here? I'm thinking of omissions of event of history. Do you want to say something more about the question, Jennifer, if you're thinking about something specific?
Loved the essay on labor, work, and action. I thought it was one of the best ones I've ever read. And it got me thinking, which is always helpful. And a couple of things, that difference between work and labor, and raising up of that whole historical idea of raising up of labor as really great. But then the first thing I think is, but when I hear about, people laboring, there's really no power there. And I always see a lot of people who have power holding up labor, but I never see labor having power. But that's sort of aside. What I'm talking about here with cultural memory is, if you erase memory culturally, then as a culture, you can't honor it and move forward from great events of history. And I'm specifically thinking about women's liberation movement history, which shifted this entire country. But yet I'm hard pressed to find a monument or a park or a boulevard named for some of those women, or the women's liberation movement itself. So fighting to get statues of women. I was just at a public school the other day, and Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, another man, and then Rosa Parks was down at the bottom. And I always look at that, and I always see the honoring of Cesar Chavez, whereas Dolores Huerta was equally, they were partners, but she gets dropped out a lot. And she's still alive doing all this stuff. That's a brainwashing in my mind, so that when we come up as the people, who are we seeing as our people who shape our country? As who do we follow? I'm thinking from a child's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's a loss of cultural memory that carries on. And then women, if you're talking about women's liberation movement history, how do we be ourselves in the public sphere if that whole history that reshaped our country is in a cloud somewhere, that it's not in a physical honoring space? If you just go to Washington, D.C. and look at the park of all the statues, the main...
The mall.
The mall. I don't think there's a woman. Maybe one? I don't think so. And that, to me, is a cultural crisis that sort of rests always underneath us, and that no one really pushes to say, we've got a problem here. Anyway, I'm always sorting through those thoughts. And so when I read this essay, and when you were talking about memory and brainwashing, it sort of hit me, women's liberation movement, omission.
Yeah, so I mean, you raised many very good points, and I don't have any clear answers in any sense. There is certainly a shortage of statues commemorating the various women who have done work historically in the United States, politically, and otherwise. And that has been somewhat acknowledged publicly. And I know there have been, I think there have
Yeah.
been some initiatives in the past few years
We sort of started talking about this around 2007, 2008, 2009, and it was still not happening. Lately, I mean, there was a lot of talk back then about women on the money. And so women on money has become a big issue. I mean,
I think
trying to put
on the $20 bill, I think isn't
that
Harriet
has been,
Tubman
we've
slated
pushed for
to
that.
appear on
That's
the.
going to be out soon. We've pushed for that.
Though I'm
But I
not
mean,
sure what
even
Arendt would think of remembering women's words and deeds on currency, which has a very
right.
certain
No,
kind of
I
use.
know, but I mean, that's why I was saying here, I kept it very broad. I
Yeah.
kept it broad. But to me, memory, individual memory, is I think what she was talking about. But then I just kind of pulled it into cultural memory because that's something I think about a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I
And how
wanted
that
to
relates to the public space. Sorry.
I wanted to jump in on this partly because you're talking about feminist history, and when you say loss, I have to question that. I feel that the feminist history was obliterated, not just lost. And the same with African American history. Even Rosa Parks, her actual background and history have been very much downplayed. Even Martin Luther King's real role has been downplayed. So I don't know if you can call it loss. I think it's been a very deliberate way of dealing with history.
So there's.
And that obliteration, that's interesting to me because how do you stop the majority of people? And I'm going to say something that I know this may be so wrong, but I have to throw it out like this. If we're free in the public space, but the public space is decidedly, in terms of monuments, statues, federal holidays, is decidedly male. How do girls and women move through the public space? I think we move through adopting male attributes instead of adopting female. Anyway, this is like way off topic, but obviously I'm still thinking
No,
this one's
it's not off topic. So Arendt has a very specific understanding of the public political sphere, the space of appearances that we enter into. And I think so there's two things here. One is the idea that we all have a right to be remembered in word and deed and through cultural forms, which do constitute a collective memory, which allow us to carry our traditions and inheritance forth as a people with one another. But I think there's also a question about what kind of ethical, political responsibility we have toward one another to maintain, these public spaces so that everyone can appear equally. In other places in Arendt's writing, she talks about in the Promise of Politics, and I think towards in the Crisis of Culture essay, which comes in between the two that we read for this week, she talks about how, of course, people need a certain level of income. Of course, there should be good housing, right? We need to fulfill certain requirements of laboring before we can appear in public before one another. But I think there's also this question around plurality, which is so fundamental to the way that she understands how we appear, how we engage in word, and how we are then recognized as equals in these public spaces. I think today as a society, at least in the United States, we're really wrestling with this question of whether or not public spaces are equal for all individuals who want to enter into them. And it's something that you brought up the statues, so I was thinking about the monuments that are being torn down because a number of people argue that they make the space non-inhabitable. But Arendt's not just thinking about public space. I'll just add really quick architecturally in terms of, going to the mall in DC or going to a public square. She's thinking about public spaces that are constituted when we come together. Even in this kind of reading constellation where we're talking about serious political questions with one another. I think the other question we can talk that you raised, Jennifer, is the question of labor, which I always struggle with in Arendt's writing, and was at the wonderful conference we had last week. Was talking with a few people about the labor work distinction, and that one of the crises that we're facing today politically is a loss of dignity in labor. People don't feel like their labor is recognized. This is one of the narratives that has unfolded around the election of Donald Trump. And also Arendt raises the specter of technology and how it's going to reshape society. Automation and technological forms which are taking jobs, the truck driving industry, all of these. I think we have to fundamentally reconsider the shape of the idea of labor today, and how individuals derive meaning from the laboring activity. Not everybody produces great artworks or is a teacher. My brother goes to a factory every day in Detroit and helps make automobiles. And he has a very old school style union job on a line. And he voted for Trump, and he is very frustrated with the way that, he's very aware of how his position in society is seen. And it's something that we've had a number of conversations about. And so I don't read Arendt as trying to take away dignity from labor or the laboring activity. I see her trying to push against the elevation of labor as a form of action, and a critique of the way that Marx wants us to understand labor as an activity. I think she thinks labor is necessary, work is necessary, and action is necessary, and all of these things coexist together.
I think, actually, she says some quite beautiful things about labor and it's being part of this natural process, and how really satisfying and joyful that can be. That's not sufficient given what she sees the humans are capable of. But I think it's quite wonderful, that piece, and you should send it to your brother.
Yeah. What do we have? Harold suggests that instead of going to DC, we go to the Seneca Falls National Women's Hall of Fame, which is a good suggestion. And Jennifer asks, but aren't the labor jobs going the way of automation? Yeah, that was my point, Jennifer, is that, so in this second piece, we have Arendt thinking about the changing quality of labor in this era of, we'll just call it technology. And she doesn't develop it as much as she might have, but I think that she gives us a good stepping off place to think about the relationship between the time of labor and what activities are being replaced or could be replaced by technological forms, and how we think about human activities like the necessity of laboring in a society where laboring could very well become obsolete in the future. So what happens in that space? We have to add to this conversation our technological world, its reshaping of labor work action, its privatization of thinking through intellectual property, its restructuring of the public sphere, etc. All these ideas of the modern age have changed in the postmodern age. The privatization of thinking through intellectual property and how it's restructuring the public sphere. Yes, and I think the ways in which social media and digital media are restructuring spaces where we appear before one another and make arguments, and the ways in which many of these platforms are interacting with the users to generate new labor economies. So a simple example is the way Facebook generates income from user interaction. And so at the conference last week, Sarah Yaffe gave a wonderful talk on the teacher strikes that have been going on. And somebody challenged her argument that Facebook groups are public spaces where we can organize public political events. And she said most of the teacher strikes began in Facebook groups, and they were organized in Facebook groups and carried out through them. That's the platform that they used infrastructurally to get the movement going. But at the same time, these kinds of digital technology spaces are using user content to generate all kinds of information, which is then sold to third-party companies and is generative of phenomenal wealth. And so there's a conversation being had right now about whether or not this is a new form of labor that we as users of social media platforms are providing to corporations, and whether or not we should be compensated for this labor, which is very much, I think, a conflation of intellectual labor and then work also in certain senses. This technology is being used in Amazon warehouses where people run and get the box, they pack the boxes and they have quotas that they have to meet. They have started making the workers wear Fitbits. And so they track their productivity through the Fitbits to determine whether or not they're moving as quickly essentially as they can and doing as much as they can. And then they're selling the data about productivity to third-party companies. So the workers are being punished or rewarded accordingly for these technologies, but they're also then generating more income for their employers and not being compensated for it. So those are two examples, Howard, that sprang to mind while I was reading your question about how what we even consider to be labor, generative of products that have economic value, is changing radically. And then also just the way in which technology is reshaping the way workers are treated in the workplace, and the future of labor. I don't have any answers. I just have grim scenarios. I'm sorry if you want to respond. Jennifer wrote, news to me on Fitbits at Amazon. That sounds like something that would happen in an AI world. It does. It sounds like an episode of Black Mirror in one way or another. But in Amor Mundi, I think 2 weeks ago, we featured an article where there is now a cafe in Providence where you don't pay with money for coffee or snacks. You pay with your personal information. And then somebody who is representing brands which have contracted with the cafe will sit with you and give you a spiel while you enjoy your coffee. So you're selling your personal information has such economic value that we won't need wallets soon. That's another bad example. If you missed that piece. Howard followed up. We saw the world as human production. Many present Marxists believe we no longer have production. Yes, we have a new world that manipulates information and is urban centered. The workday is no longer 9 to 5 days a week. The workplace has free food, recreation, social opportunity. Yeah, so there are, a few different things going on there. One of the conversations that a number of, not just Marxists, but but I think economists are having is that the fundamental nature of labor and work has changed in our even our post-service economy, where most of the goods being produced are not actually physical goods anymore, the ones that generate the most wealth. There are things like futures or commodities that are being abstractly traded and sold. And so the production of actual things has radically shifted. And I'm not an economist. I wish I could say more about that, but I do know it's a conversation that many people are having. And yes, workplaces have tried to become more life work balance friendly by including gyms and childcare and restaurants, and so you never have to leave work now, essentially. Not that any of us ever leave work anyway. That's a bad joke. Are there any other questions or passages in either of these essays that people wanted to look at?
Sam, this is
Yes.
Suzanne again. Your last comment sort of leads me to ask if I can read something. Just as I started the readings this week, a quotation from Thomas Merton entered my life, and suddenly I wanted to have lunch with both Thomas Merton and Hana Oran together and say, so what do you think of this? So
Yeah.
if it's okay, I just like to read the quotation.
Sure.
Okay. There is a pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist most easily succumbs: activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is to succumb to violence. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. So that that kind of stopped me in my tracks because I felt like he was describing my life. And
Yeah.
and also I kind of blame Hannah Arendt a bit for the kind of level of political involvement I find myself in now. But somehow I think there's something in between the two. I mean, I think that when she talks about thinking, in some ways she is talking about his call for this pulling back a bit to kind of reclaim one's sense of inner peace. I don't know. I'm just curious what other people would make of that. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
Thomas Merton, I mean, he's very much the Catholic monk, become Buddhist monk. So it's another world. But religion seems to enter Arendt's discourse often enough that I think she'd be intrigued with what he has to say here.
Yeah, I think so. One of the prerequisites for thinking the way that she conceptualizes it as a two-in-one dialogue that one has with oneself is a need for self-harmony, that we can't be out of sync with ourselves in any way, but also she's drawing it out of Kant, and she's thinking about self-harmony as a way in which we hold ourselves accountable for our actions in the world. So in thinking in moral considerations, she has a very nice, concise paragraph and a half where she was talking about Eichmann and why we don't murder, right? We don't kill people. We're not violent because, not because it's bad, morally bad, because the law tells us it's bad, right? But we don't do that because we would have to spend the rest of our life with a murderer, and we would destroy our facility for thinking, our capacity for thinking, because we would be out of harmony with ourself. And so I always find in Arendt a very a strong sense of retaining fidelity to oneself and holding oneself accountable. I'm not sure if that does that speak to what you were. I mean, that's
Yeah.
part of what I heard in the Merton
Yeah.
quote that you read.
Yeah. I think so.
She also says that, she says, what is the content of thinking? Experience, nothing else. It's experience. We have to have experiences in the world. We have to engage in politics in order to think, right? That we have to have experience to think from. Thinking, she says, always deals with invisibles, the impressions of our interactions with the world. So when we go home at the end of the day and we sit down and we engage in this conversation with ourselves, we're drawing in our experiences in the world and the people that we've spoken with and what we've done. And there's a sense of a need to care for that, a space of thinking within oneself, to protect it. Howard wrote in the question box. Does anybody else want to comment on that, on the quote on thinking and violence, before we move on? So Howard wrote, the question of violence has also changed. It is no longer the exclusive franchise of the state. Was it ever the exclusive franchise of the state? The state certainly claimed a monopoly on violence, but I'm not sure it was ever the exclusive franchise of the state. The state has privatized its right to use violence. Man, you sound like a real radical, Howard. Privatize has privatized its right to use violence, both by hiring private enforcement protection companies to do public work and also by praising the private use of violence, as President Trump did yesterday. I did not catch what President Trump praised yesterday, fortunately, although I'm sure someone can tell me right now. I stayed away from social media yesterday. I need breaks every now and then to maintain my own self-harmony. But you can let me know. So there are at least two different things here that one is that, a claim on who has the right to violence and what violence is. One of the conversations we're having right now is about what constitutes violence and what forms of speech acts or monuments might be violent. And sometimes violence is treated purely as a legal category, as something which is clearly defined in some way. I don't think Arendt would take us directly down that path, since she is very wary of moral categories that have been set forth from authorities. We always have to engage with them. So who has the right to violence? When are we legitimate in using violence? I mean, violence for Arendt is always a means ends thing. She calls it an instrument. It is something that we pick up and use to a certain end. It's not political for her. It's not political because violence doesn't speak. She doesn't say that directly in the labor, work, and action piece that we read, but she has the turn of phrase about how what is silent is not appearing, right? It can't be heard. Certainly violence, though, is visible. The other thing is the privatization of law enforcement and the military, which has been progressively happening in the United States for quite a while, alongside other traditionally public institutions, which the privatization of public institutions and I think this is what you're pushing toward, also radically reshapes the way that we think about the work performed by the people who work for those institutions. So how does the militarization of a police force change the way that policing as a form of work is done in local communities? Or how does the hiring of private contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan shape the way soldiers do their work in war spaces? That's a really great question. I have no real answer. I have no real answer for you. Certainly, people have argued that it leads to more violence. That with the beginning of the war on drugs in the 80s, there was a shift in the language amongst police from patrolling communities to being at war with communities. So the language used reshapes the work too, is what I want to say, in the way that these professions, which are understood to be the kind of institutions that have that monopoly on violence, are able to use that violence to certain ends. But I mean, I feel like I'm dancing around it a little bit. I wish you could unmute your microphone, Howard, so you could respond. Does anyone else want to respond? Thinking about that.
I wanted to respond back to Suzanne's quote, because one of the things that struck me in the essay on the human condition was this statement, page 326, is about adjusting to new conditions speedily and not realizing how fast we adjust. And I think that is very related to the Merton quote, because we have adjusted to this fast-paced, constant barrage of media and devices, and we've just adjusted. And as you pointed out, we're never away from work because we're now expected to respond 24/7 to these work-related emails and texts and so forth. So I think that the loss of the time to contemplate, or even the possibility for most people to take time and declare that as important when gazillion things are demanding your attention, I think is very much about adapting to this pace that we're now dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I just I reviewed this Thinking Without a Banister volume for the LA Review of Books, and I ended it with that question precisely. Arendt was always asking, where do we go? In thinking, she asked, where do we go when we think? Right? Thinking about it spatially in the space necessary for thinking. And so I think to that we can add today, do we have time to think? One of my favorite statistics is the American Time Use Survey, which is conducted every year by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they ask people how much time they spend thinking every day. And on average, Americans spend 17 minutes thinking a day. They spend about 3 hours watching TV. I'm not sure what they're measuring exactly, or how people are thinking about what it means to think when they ask the question. But I think it's an interesting, to imagine how people, imagine themselves sitting down to think and then only doing it for 17 minutes a day. The other part of that, Susan, I think is, I'm in my home right now doing work in a private space, in a public activity that's also a work activity. I have my email turned off as not to be disrupted while we're having this chat. And I often turn off my email entirely. But even with a computer, with certain forms of technology that we keep in our homes, there's a there's a real sense of presence which prevents feeling alone. And for Arendt, being able to be alone without being lonely is necessary to engage in the activity of thinking. And if you unplug your cell phone, unplug the computer, put them, in the car, in the office, and come home and have no technology in the private space, to me, at least today, it's a very jarring feeling, and I feel the absence of the outside world in my space. And that, though, is necessary to engage in this kind of contemplative thinking that Arendt is describing. But the work conditions today make it very difficult to turn off my email for even 24 hours. But when I manage to do it for at least 12, I always feel very reassured that the world is still there. That it does not need me, that it can go on without me, and that I can sit and read a book for pleasure, or write poetry, or engage in some other non-work related activity. I think, this goes very much to the quote and this idea of retaining a sense of fidelity to oneself, but doing what is necessary to retain a sense of harmony with oneself. And the way in which technology is breaking down the private-public distinction these days. Connell had to leave. Good night, if you've already left, Connell. I guess it's evening there. Jennifer said, yes, the language reshapes, so do actions. Yes, the language of war did emerge in the 80s on the heels of Carter. Carter placed solar panels on the White House and Reagan removed them. I didn't know that. Too effeminate. Did he say it was too effeminate? Or are you being funny? The effeminate is my
Didn't
personal
say the
opinion.
word
Okay, there we
effeminate.
go. Of course. Okay.
Can't stop
There you
myself. It's just who I am.
No, that's fine.
But
I can never stop myself either. I'm very sympathetic.
he didn't say effeminate. That's not a word he would use, but it had something to do with that's not who we are. It was something like that. I could look up the actual words, but I remember when it happened. So as soon as Reagan got into the White House, he removed the solar panels off the roof. And I had mentioned this to someone on Facebook. I'm trying to get off that damn thing. But I mentioned it saying, how much further ahead would we be on the climate change issue if those had stayed there? Also, solar panels, the making of them is labor.
Sure.
So solar panels is labor, renewables are labor. So if you go back to 2016, Hillary had the plan to lead the world on renewables. Renewables is labor and work. But the conversation and the image of the laborer in America is decidedly a male image with a hard hat. So that image has to shift. And the country is not ready to shift there when we have men imbuing labor with a male atmosphere. And I felt that all the time, every time I heard the word labor. It wasn't about the woman in the cafeteria putting food on a tray. It was the man in the car factory.
Yes.
And so how do you change that consciousness around those words? If we had a different consciousness around those words, leading the world in renewables, her plan, which helps climate change, would have been more easily accessible for people.
In Arendt's account of labor here and in the human condition does not take into account the way in which we hear the word labor as a gendered, as a kind of gendered activity. But maybe Arendt can be helpful to us in that way because she understands labor to be any form of bodily laboring that produces a consumable object. I was walking across campus yesterday and I don't know where they got it from. I'm surprised it wasn't stolen, or I'm surprised they make them, but there was a sign that said men at work. like the old orange pylons, they had found some, or whoever they had contracted brought them, and they put them up all the way down the street. And they were trimming trees and doing, detailing, but it was a kind of jarring moment, because I'm very much aware of what you're saying, and what I think a lot of, the sensitivity and awareness we have about the way we think about labor as a gendered activity. But then we also have this crystallized image in our cultural memory of labor as construction workers, or men on a factory line. And shifting that over time will, I think, take time. But for Arendt, the way we experience the world changes the way we think about the world, changes the way the world is. And then over time, this is the process of experiencing and thinking about interacts to reshape that collective, I think, conversation in the way that we think about these terms.
Right.
But
But
I
I have to say though, those terms and like the men at work thing, they
Yeah.
were talking about that. They were talking about that in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, sure.
So these conversations originated in that time. But
Yeah.
here we are in the 21st century. How much longer do we wait? So, and that comes back to the public space and our male public space. If we had more women to see, how would that reshape our consciousness? But
Well, I
if we're
think,
rooted in this maleness, we can't move ahead.
well, more women than ever are running for Congress right now, in the midterm elections, which are fast approaching. So I don't think you're alone in thinking that way. And I think Theda Skocpol said during her panel last week, there's this kind of fold the laundry attitude that women have that she's been talking to, men don't do it right, so I'm just going to get it done. Like that, it's not being done right, so we're just stepping in. Women are starting to step in and to do this. And the majority of women who she was giving statistics on the organization of the Trump resistance movement and the Tea Party movement, and far and away it's women. It's, white middle class women. She had a whole breakdown up there. You can watch it online of I think one of the statistics was 90% of the people participating in weekly meetups for the Trump resistance are women, engaging politically. So I think it says something about the cultural moment that we're living in right now. Susan, you
I just
were,
wanted to say I'm wanting to question whether Arendt's concepts is non-gendered, since she uses only the male pronoun. And I have to say that despite not wanting to judge her from, this point in history, is very difficult for me when
yeah.
I read that. So to me, maybe you can say how that's non-gendered. It feels very gendered to me.
So I posted a picture on Twitter. Here we go. I posted a picture of Twitter on Arendt's birthday last Sunday of her standing 1966 meeting for the national public press awards, I think it was, and it's her in the middle of six men. And I took a quote from the Gauss interview where he asks something. I'm gonna mess up the quote precisely, but he asks her something like, do you find being a woman, the woman problem, do you find the woman problem a problem for you, being in this masculine profession? And she says, of course, it's always a problem, but she does her work. She's writing in she's coming out of, I think, contextually and culturally, political philosophy has used the word man for a long time. One of the common explanations I hear for her persistence in using it across her writing is that in German you have Mann and man, so Mann means all people. It doesn't just mean man. But she's not a feminist. Can't defend her as a feminist. She is not going to make an argument for a politics rooted in any kind of understanding of a feminism. That would be contradictory to her understanding of thinking. It's for the same reason she's critical of any kind of dialectical thinking as a determinist framework. But she also, you could read her as being a little more radical in the sense that when we appear before one another in the public realm, we appear as equals. She certainly did that, I think, and has always been a kind of model to me in that way, at least, in holding her own, and without having to emphasize or draw attention to the fact that she's a woman. And that is quite difficult to do oftentimes. I am quite often the only woman on a panel in political theory, or at, our political science conferences. The first seminar I took in graduate school had 16 people, 2 women. It's a kind of, in certain professions, there's still very much, as Arendt said, yeah, of course it's a problem, but you do the work. You're doing it for other reasons. And how you deal with that varies, I think. But I cannot defend her as a feminist. I can't do it.
Can I just say one more
She's
thing?
not.
Can I just say
Yes.
one extra thing?
Yes.
And I mentioned this last time. When she's interviewed, and it was online, Roger sent it to me. The man
The
asked
Günter
her,
Gauss interview?
Gauss.
Gauss.
He said something about women and men, and she said,
Yeah.
why would a woman want to lead? It's unfeminine. Why would a woman want to give orders?
So
Now,
that comes after the quote that I posted. Yes. She
Right.
says, I've always found certain
So-
professions unsuited for women.
Yes.
Women. She had a,
So,
she had
but to me, what
understanding.
is lacking for me in her work is she passed away in 1975.
Yes.
That 70 was like the peak, the start of the muscle of the women's liberation movement. But I have yet to find anything she wrote about. But it was all happening in New York. A lot of it was happening around the country, but a lot of the media was focused on them in New York. That's where you get the Steinem stuff and Betty Friedan. But it was happening all over the country. But yet I can't find anything she wrote on that. And I just, as I read her, and I love her, I'm dying for some meat on what was happening and how she perceived the
You're
New
not
York
going to
thing.
get it. She's,
But what
I mean,
but so
she's
then
a
there's a
philosopher.
separation.
Yeah.
But if you're a philosopher and those women are discussing language and the
Yeah.
public space, they're saying we demand to be equal in the public space.
Yeah.
What did she think about that?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. She does not take up the woman's question as a political question. It's not part of the work that she's doing. Her work is always, I think, in one way or another, responding to the appearance of totalitarianism in the world, and she's thinking about fascism and freedom. She's very critical of identity politics in the sense that we would understand it today, explicitly so. And so she's never going to start an engagement from that point of inquiry. In the archive, there are a number of, I'm curious, I'll poke through them, but it's not going to be rewarding. She was receiving a number of mailers and different literatures about some of the feminist organizations that were happening around Columbia at the time. Also anti-Vietnam War literature as well. But I haven't found any evidence that she actively engaged with them. So. It's not surprising, so just to kind of note, so it's not surprising that a conversation about labor, work, and action takes us in this path. 2 years ago at Bard, we organized a small conference around Arendt and natality through contemporary feminist literature. And the pieces from that conference are in the newest volume of the journal. And they're also, you can watch the papers, the discussions online. And there are a number of great pieces to take a look at if you want to dig into how contemporary political theorists, feminist theorists are treating Arendt's concept of natality and labor. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I will see you again in a couple of weeks. And I appreciate all of the conversation and questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Sam.
Bye.